We have an especially terrific person here. And as you may know, the purpose of this series is to present neighbors of ours who are doing things that are of national and worldwide impact. And that's certainly the case here. And Fred Hof has a remarkable record. He spent the first 20 years of his adult active life in the military, fought in Vietnam, won Purple Heart, went on after that in the military to become a Middle Eastern specialist, learned Arabic, somehow managed to bring conflict with him everywhere he went. He went to Beirut,
unfortunately,
military attaché there during the Civil War, and survived that, as well as Vietnam. And then worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon. And after 1990, he was in private practice, consulting business for a while. He was called back by the State Department after George Mitchell was the special envoy in the Middle East. And he, from 2009 to 2011, he was the main mediator of an effort by American administrations to settle the terrible Israeli-Syrian conflict, and got very close. He has donated copies of his book about that, which is a fascinating book, which we are selling at a considerable discount, and the proceeds will go to this very good cause. So if you enjoy what you hear now, there's lots more in that book. Wonderful book. That mediation came to a tragic end because of rather murderous response by the Syrian regime to peaceful protests from the front, which meant it would be very hard to create a peace that sustained Bashar al-Assad in power. But he remained on the job and was given the rank of ambassador after the tragic events in Syria, because he continued to work with foreign governments, and President Clinton, I guess it was, felt that title really important mover. But by that time, peace was no longer in sight. It was very close. He was named. He worked at the Atlantic Council after that, and then, I guess 5 or 6 years ago, was named ambassador in residence at Barton College, where he is now. And his students have this map, and he teaches them all about everything on here, and has even written the name Euphrates River, where it appears, if they don't know where that is. So, if you're wondering what that tiny writing is that doesn't go with the rest of this cartography.
Yeah, that's me. That's me.
Is fine. And it's in a particularly appropriate time to talk about the Middle East now and where we are. And he is supremely qualified to talk about it. So,
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Well, Peter's overly generous introduction reminds me of the favorite introduction I ever heard. This was about 6 or 7 years ago when Brenda and I were still in the D.C. area, and I was invited to a program at the Brookings Institution. And the guest of honor was Dr. Henry Kissinger. Okay? So we're all seated in the audience. Kissinger is up on the stage, sitting in a chair. A friend of mine, who is going to be moderating and basically interviewing the former Secretary of State, sitting next to him. And my friend kicked it off by saying, well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we should get right down to business, because obviously our honored guest today needs no introduction. And Kissinger looked at him and he said, "Not so fast, not so fast, not so fast. Let's hear the introduction." This had obviously been rehearsed because my buddy just launched into an introduction that was even longer than Peter's. Such a thing is possible. I should confess right up front that I've been really worried a lot about what to say to you this evening. The title of this is something about challenges faced by the U.S. in the Middle East. Well, there's no shortage of challenges facing the United States in the Middle East, obviously. We could easily, I'm afraid to say, be at war with Iran before this year is out. We have soldiers on the ground fighting Islamist terrorists in Syria and Iraq. Our relationship with Israel is in trouble. Humanitarian catastrophes that are overwhelming Syria and Yemen could get even worse. Lebanon, a country that used to be described as the Switzerland of the Middle East, now 80% of the population is below the poverty line. The young man now leading the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, one of our closest historical partners, finds the leaders of China and Russia to be more to his liking than the current president of the United States. So, where to begin? And in the course of 45 minutes, where to end? More importantly, however, the real challenge reminds me of what the British actor George Sanders reportedly said to a reporter in 1949 when he was about to become Zsa Zsa Gabor's third husband. Asked what he thought about becoming Miss Gabor's newest spouse, Sanders said words to the effect of, "I know what to do. The question is how to make it interesting." My main challenge this evening is to try to make it interesting. I've been involved with the Middle East for nearly 60 years, starting as an American Field Service exchange student in high school, military service, State Department service, think tank scholar, and now Bard College professor. I know what to do, but how to make it interesting. I asked my wife, Brenda, what I should do. She said, tell a story. Everyone loves a story. For the love of God, don't give a boring lecture. Tell an interesting story, and when you're done, let people ask you questions about anything they like. Okay, one thing I know how to do is take instruction. So I'm going to tell you a story. Better yet, I'm going to tell you 3 stories, each from a different part of my checkered past, in a part of the world shown on the map that I've handed out to you. Each story was selected in the hope that it would be interesting, and because each one, in its own way, makes a point about a challenge our country still faces in a neighborhood, in a part of the world that successive American presidents have been trying to escape from. So here's the first story. July 1981. I reported to the American Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, as the new United States Army attaché. Anybody here know what a military attaché does? Any idea? You know. Okay. Military attaché is a uniformed member of the armed forces. Could be Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps. she or he is assigned to the embassy in full diplomatic status to advise the ambassador on military matters, to represent her or his service to the host country military, and probably more than anything else, to report, to gather information about the military situation, information of military relevance, write it up, and send it back to the Pentagon. Okay? When I arrived in Lebanon, the country was already in its 6th year of a terribly destructive civil war. An American ambassador had been assassinated. The capital city, Beirut, was divided by what they called the Green Line, separating warring militias and making travel from one part of the city to the other very, very hazardous. No one was in charge in Lebanon. Even traffic cops were just routinely ignored. It was anarchy and it was bedlam. The catalyst for that war was the presence in Lebanon of Palestinian fighters trying to keep up some kind of resistance to Israel. They were under the command of Yasser Arafat, who then was the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. The PLO was using Lebanese territory to shell and harass Israel. Many Lebanese, mainly Muslims, supported the PLO. Many Lebanese, mainly Christians, opposed the PLO. These Lebanese fought one another constantly. The Lebanese government became powerless and irrelevant as Lebanese militias battled one another, as Palestinians and Israelis routinely exchanged fire, and as yet another party, Syria, was occupying large parts of the country. It was, to say the least, a multifaceted mess. My main job was to travel around the country, try to make sense of this confusing military situation, and report back to Washington. It was dangerous work, and more than once I was detained by parties not very happy with my presence and not really caring all that much about my protected diplomatic status. But one piece of travel, one that lasted less than an hour, was burned into my memory forever. One day I was safely behind my desk in the embassy, writing reports, when our operations coordinator handed me an urgent cable from the U.S. Defense Attaché in our embassy in Tel Aviv, Israel. According to the cable, Israel had spotted a terrorist helicopter under construction in southwestern Beirut, in the capital city, anticipating a Palestinian suicide operation of some kind. Israel's Air Force was prepared to strike this helicopter and eliminate it totally. Timing was uncertain, but our colleagues in Israel gave us the precise location of the helicopter in question. I looked at a map and determined that the helicopter was in a densely populated area, maybe 20 minutes by car from the embassy. It was not inside of a Palestinian military camp. It's in a regular residential area. So I jumped into my car, Chrysler K car, if anybody can remember that vintage, the most miserable automobile in the world. But I jumped into the car and drove as quickly as I could to the designated location. Not hard to find. What I saw scared the hell out of me. The sanded, smoothed off, and freshly painted skeleton of a small helicopter. Probably a long retired veteran of Lebanese civil aviation, sitting on top of a metal shed in what seemed to be a playground, perhaps associated with a nearby school. It was bolted down, free of any instrumentation, no weaponry. It had a small ladder leaning against the shed. Obviously, the terrorist helicopter was meant to serve recreational purposes. It was going nowhere, but it was on Israel's bullseye. For all I knew, Israeli jets were already warming up or on the way. I raced back to the embassy as quickly as I could. This was many years before the days of cellular communications. And once inside the embassy, I drafted a flash, meaning highest priority, cable to our defense attaché office in Tel Aviv. It took me about 15 minutes to write the cable and get it off. And it was partly written, believe it or not, in verse, albeit the worst poetry imaginable. There once was a chopper, it is no more. It has no engine, it has no door. This steady descent into doggerel aside, I concluded in prose that the planned operation needed to be canceled for a disaster to be averted. Now, some didn't take very kindly to my approach in writing this cable. My resort to poetry was criticized, appropriately so perhaps, as unprofessional by the Tel Aviv defense attaché, an Air Force colonel. But my intent had been to maximize attention, both in Tel Aviv and in Washington, to try to avoid something truly horrific happening. And my Tel Aviv colleagues, to their everlasting credit, wasted no time in enabling Israel to cancel the planned operation. I wonder to this day if the potential catastrophe had been the product of faulty air reconnaissance, false reporting by a Lebanese informer seeking a paycheck, or some combination of the two. During my tenure in Lebanon, I was not aware of and had no occasion to report terror operations on the part of Israel. Indeed, the Israeli Defense Forces may have been counting on an American military attaché in Beirut to eyeball the prospective target before taking additional steps. And as I think back on this incident, I'm reminded that the horrors of combat in the Middle East, and not just in the Middle East, today being the first anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, the horrors of combat fall with overwhelming disproportion on defenseless civilians. Yes, non-combatants always suffer in war. Even if Israel had used great precision to destroy what it thought was a terrorist helicopter, Civilians, most likely children in this case, would have been killed. It would not have been intentional, but surely it would have happened if the operation had gone forward, if it had taken place. Those kids would be just as dead, no matter the good intentions of the attacker. It is, however, another matter entirely when civilians are deliberately targeted by a terrorist government, as has been the case in Syria for the last 12 years. Our failure, the American failure, to lift a finger to defend those civilians, even after President Obama, in whose administration I served, drew a red line to warn the Syrian government against using chemical weapons. That failure led the president of Russia to conclude we were weak, that our rhetoric was much stronger than our actions. He took Crimea, Vladimir Putin, he took Crimea, he intervened militarily in Syria, and 1 year ago today, he invaded the rest of Ukraine. Civilian slaughter in Syria, featuring, among other things, a Russian Air Force specializing in the destruction of hospitals, made the recent earthquake the icing on a completely poisoned cake. And if civilians are on the bullseye, terrorists in groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, will always be able to recruit and gain supporters. We talk a lot about protecting civilians. On Holocaust Memorial Day, our leaders never fail to speak the words, "Never again." But when we proclaim our dedication to the protection of civilians and then do nothing, we place in dire risk their lives and our reputation. Okay, second story. Early 2001, I was living in Jerusalem, serving as the chief of staff of something called the Sharm el-Sheikh Fact-Finding Committee. This small, temporary international organization was headed by the former U.S. Senate Majority Leader, George Mitchell of Maine. It had been formed to investigate why a new round of Palestinian-Israeli violence had recently broken out, and to recommend steps to stop the violence and get the two sides back to negotiations. I had been out of the Army for nearly 10 years and was taking a leave of absence from my private sector job to help lead the investigation and write the committee's report. Now, the violence that was taking place was often deadly. Israeli soldiers would sometimes use live ammunition and rubber bullets that had metal inserts that made them very, very lethal to suppress rock-throwing Palestinian protesters. Palestinians had lynched 2 Israelis who had made the wrong turn driving in a Palestinian city. Neither side had any confidence in the intentions of the other side, to say the least. Palestinian protest demonstrations were the venues for much of the violence and bloodshed. On a Friday afternoon, after Friday prayers, a British colleague and I traveled a few miles outside of Jerusalem to observe a demonstration. What we saw taught us a lot. First, we visited the Israeli military position. There was an armored car and 4 soldiers. 2 of the soldiers were teenagers. The other 2, not much older. As I recall, there was a sergeant who was maybe 23 years old. There were no officers present. There was not even a senior sergeant present. As Palestinian demonstrators advanced toward the soldiers, hurling rocks with slingshots, my colleague and I were painfully aware that a mass casualty international incident could take place right in front of our eyes. We urged the Israeli soldiers to remain calm. Again, no officers were present on the Israeli side. We drove around to the Palestinian side. There we saw plenty of older males, but they were standing safely in the rear, urging teenagers, some of them very, very young, to advance toward the Israeli teenagers with their slingshots. Just as we had on the Israeli side, we urged people to calm down and avoid violence. But we left with a sense, I must say, of profound alarm and even disgust. Where, on both sides, were the adults? It's a question that's still on my mind 20 years later, as young Palestinians and young Israelis still bear the burden of a conflict sorely lacking in adult leadership. Several weeks later, George Mitchell, who was based in New York while I was running the operation in Jerusalem, George Mitchell came out for a visit. Israel had, from the beginning of our mission, refused to cooperate fully with us. They feared that we wanted to indict Israeli soldiers for war crimes. Totally not part of our mission. I even gave the Israeli Ministry of Defense the 2 letters of instructions from President Clinton saying we were not to consider any such thing. Our job was to not to make a bad situation even worse. But there had just been an election in Israel, producing a new prime minister and a new Israeli government. The foreign ministry, now headed by Shimon Peres, invited us to hear the testimony of Israeli parents who had lost young children to acts of terrorism. We accepted the invitation, A, because we were interested in what the parents would have to say, and B, we wanted the full cooperation of the new Israeli government in our fact-finding mission. So, Mitchell and I end up seated at a small table in the middle of a big auditorium. Facing us was a group of young men and women, aggrieved parents, sitting at a long table. 4 couples spoke in turn. As I recall, 2 of them in English, 2 in Hebrew that was translated for us. They spoke in turn, describing their children, the horrifically violent ways in which their lives had ended, and how they were trying, for the sake of spouses and surviving children, to cope with their losses. Their testimony was completely devoid of any political commentary. And it was accompanied by total silence, a rare occurrence in a large audience of Israelis. For me, it was emotionally crushing. I tried my best not to cry, and with great difficulty, I succeeded. Mercifully, the session ended after all the parents had spoken. Mitchell and I spoke briefly with the families and were invited outside for photos. As we were leaving to go back to our office in Jerusalem, I was stopped by the foreign minister's senior aide. "Fred," he said, "we all noticed your struggle in there. We were deeply touched. I have a message to you from Foreign Minister Perez. Anything Mr. Hof wants for the fact-finding committee, he gets. No questions asked." Naturally, I took full advantage of that offer, which was executed by Israel in totally good faith. But what I learned from this episode was something fully reinforced when dealing with the Palestinian side. The diplomatic value of genuine empathy, particularly when acting in a mediating role as kind of a middle person between two adversaries. Yes, Israelis can be gruff, they can be blunt, they can even be rude now and then. Palestinians can be histrionic, embittered, and even they can be rude now and then. But both sides genuinely want outsiders to understand their story. I found both sides more willing to cooperate when they could see we were at least open to understanding their issues and their grievances. Sadly, I found that each side sincerely considers itself to be the righteous victim of the other side. Yes, we listened to many Palestinian accounts of loss and grief as well, trying to stay composed while listening to the unspeakable. This two-sided condition of righteous victimization makes a mutually agreeable political solution between them all but impossible. A situation now aggravated by an Israeli government containing violent extremists and Palestinian leadership featuring corruption and incompetence. This will continue to be a challenge for the Biden administration to try to address, and I'm afraid I will not live long enough to see Israelis and Palestinians at peace with one another, but I hope to be wrong without having to live to be 120. That's the second story. My final story involves something called Track 2 diplomacy. This is diplomacy that takes place without officials. Okay. Sometimes it's hard for countries that have bitter disputes to directly negotiate those disputes. Often the issues dividing them are very controversial or very emotional. Sometimes there's absolutely no trust. Occasionally, there are no diplomatic relations. In cases like these, two rival countries can designate former officials, academics, and the like to meet unofficially to try to tackle the hardest issues. These discussions are off the record, but the results are reported back to the respective governments. The idea is that Track 2 discussions, often inspired and supervised by neutral third parties, can lead to official negotiations that eventually resolve whatever the problem is. Okay? 2013, 2014, I was part of an American team of former officials and academics that met several times with a similar Iranian team in Copenhagen, Denmark. We discussed many, many topics. The main one, possible terms of an agreement that would prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. In this case, our Track 2 discussions were supplementing secret official negotiations that were just starting up. These talks that I was involved in were sometimes very contentious, very angry, especially when the subject turned to Syria. But we had a Canadian chairman who ran the show fairly. Slowly, we were able to build relationships approaching trust and confidence between the two teams. And over time, we were able to speak frankly, directly, and even calmly and constructively. One day, we were having a very, very intense discussion about the nuclear issue. One of the Iranian team members asked to be heard, and here's what he said. I want to emphasize that Iran has no interest at all in developing nuclear weapons. Yes, our supreme leader has declared nuclear weapons to be anti-Islamic. But no, that is not the reason why we don't want them. Let me be blunt. This is the Iranian speaking, okay? Let me be blunt. You Americans have complained in these meetings about what we Iranians are doing in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Has it occurred to you Americans that we have been able to do these things without nuclear weapons? Has it occurred to you Americans that if we get nuclear weapons, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Turks, and the Egyptians will not be far behind? Has it occurred to you Americans that if everyone in the Middle East has nuclear weapons, we Iranians will not be able to do anything without enduring the threat of nuclear annihilation? Every time we make a move, it's going to be like the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. What he said made a certain amount of logical sense to me. Okay, I replied, so let me ask one thing. If what you're saying is true, then why are we having these Track 2 discussions? Why are official negotiations over a possible nuclear deal starting to take place? If you don't want nuclear weapons, why not just give the United Nations carte blanche to come in and inspect anywhere it wants in Iran? You can do that without negotiations, right? My Iranian counterpart leaned toward me from across the table. Fred, you're right, but you're forgetting something. We want all the economic sanctions on us lifted. It is for this reason that we negotiate. Okay. My colleagues and I, as soon as these meetings were over, we reported this exchange to the White House. It seemed to us that Iran wanted to be paid not to do what it said it didn't want to do anyway. We suggested that the official talks be expanded to include Iranian bad behavior in places like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. Later, I was told by a White House contact, a friend, that President Obama, specifically in the context of Syria, rejected the idea of expanding the negotiations. He feared that to do so would jeopardize the chances for a nuclear deal, which he, President Obama, saw as the jewel in the crown of his foreign policy legacy. His nuclear deal was indeed reached in July 2015, and then abandoned 3 years later by President Trump. A key challenge for the Biden administration is what to do about Iran. The Iranian presence in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq has brought all three countries to ruin, to the delight of transnational terrorists seeking open, ungoverned spaces to operate. The administration would like to reinstate the nuclear agreement, but seems to have learned the lesson that an Iran flush with cash under current management is bad news for the rest of the Middle East. Indeed, the Iranian regime is bad news for the people of Iran, especially its women, as we've been reminded lately. So, those are my stories, and I'm sticking with them. Not much has changed over the past several decades, except maybe for things getting worse. As Peter mentioned, between April 2011, March 2013, I tried my best to make things better in a part of the world that, for better or worse, I've spent a lot of my life. As a State Department official, I secretly mediated between Syria and Israel, trying to help them reach a treaty of peace. We were moving towards success when suddenly violence broke out in Syria. Unarmed demonstrators protesting police brutality and unlawful detentions were fired on by army and police units. The violence spread, my peace mediation collapsed, and 12 years later, Syria is in ruins. But the story of how we nearly made it, how we might have changed history for the better, but didn't, is an interesting one, even if you're not a Middle East maven. I've donated a few copies of the book I've written about this diplomatic odyssey to the D&H Canal Historical Society. It's for sale at a price well below what you'd pay the publisher or Amazon, and all the money goes to the museum, not to me. Thank you for your attention. Like George Sanders, I hope it was interesting. Questions? Seamus.
When you were going out to that demonstration in Palestine, Israel-Palestine area with the teenagers, were you guys in uniform?
No. My British colleague was a former member of MI6 who was actually employed by the European Union and was present on my team as a civilian. And at this point, I had been a civilian for about 11 years. So no, there were no uniforms. I mean, we didn't try to disguise from people, who we were, but no uniforms.
But in Beirut, that time when you went out to the playground, were you?
The only time I wore a uniform in Beirut, in Lebanon, was when I was making I'd be making an official visit to a Lebanese army unit. I had been an artillery officer. I knew something about how to set up a battery, and I would go out and visit with Lebanese soldiers. And it was always a hair-raising experience because I'd have my fatigues on, and just driving through Syrian checkpoints and so forth. I mean, they're looking at me like, what the hell is this? We think we've seen everything in this country. What kind of a uniform is that? And but usually, if I'd be going out on what we would call a road reconnaissance, this is when we have a specific target in mind, a specific military unit. And I drive out to see what kind of information I could collect. I would be in civilian clothes. And I would try to arrange it so that I could go out with an attaché from a friendly country doing the driving. My two favorites were the Canadians and the Brits. We would do joint road recons, so somebody could do the driving and I could take some notes. And it also avoided using the K car, which was not only a horrible vehicle, but it was a dead giveaway. Who the hell was driving it? And one of the things I did that was very, very useful, except on occasion it didn't work. I had I think it was a 1936 edition of the Michelin Guide Bleu for Lebanon. And this was a marvelous edition. It had every conceivable monastery, monument, and everything. So in planning for a road reconnaissance, it was essential to consult the Guide Bleu and to have a story in mind when you're stopped. And you're always stopped at somebody's checkpoint. Okay. Yeah. So, who are you? Where are you going? I said, I'm an American diplomat, and I'm going to visit the Mar Michael monastery. Oh, go ahead. And I would arrange the route so I would drive right through, for example, a Syrian Special Forces regiment and get an idea what kind of equipment they had and things like that. Yes, sir.
In the case of Syria, in the case of Iran now, if you make the kind of peace that you're talking about and we're hoping to make, one of the things you're probably doing is helping a regime that is unpopular survive, because if you pull the sanctions and enter into friendly relations, say, between Israel and Syria, you're helping Bashar al-Assad or the Ayatollahs. How do you square those two?
Yeah. When I was doing my mediation, it was between Syria and Israel, and at the time, it appeared to just about everybody that Bashar al-Assad had the requisite amount of legitimacy in Syria to be able to speak for Syrians on matters of war and peace. Many Syrians were not happy with the economy. They were not happy with the corruption they were seeing in government, but they had hope that their young president, who would periodically promise reforms, would actually deliver. When the violence started, that quickly went out the window. Mediation went away, and there has been obviously no further American effort to try to arrange peace between Syria and Israel. For what it's worth, I think the Golan Heights, for example, are gone from Syria forever. And it's not because of some proclamation that President Trump made, or it's not because of some annexation decree that the Israelis made. Assad basically gave it away when he chose to act violently instead of politically with his own people. With the Iranians, there is still a dilemma. The Biden administration is trying to come up with a formula to address this. I'm agnostic myself despite the guy's story at the Track 2 thing, I'm agnostic about whether the Iranians really want to have a nuclear weapon or not. I don't know. I've never gotten inside the brain of the supreme leader, right? But the Biden administration is well aware of the fact that if the nuclear agreement is reestablished and sanctions are lifted, money will be pouring into Iran, and it will be leaving just as quickly through the Revolutionary Guards and the operations they're conducting in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and it'll be other places before long. So this is the real dilemma. I think President Biden also has to take into account the domestic implications. You know, just how popular would it be in the Congress if he were to suddenly announce that a nuclear agreement has been reestablished. It's an executive agreement, so it doesn't require a Senate vote to ratify it. But the Iranians, for their part, are saying, come on, let's make it a treaty. Otherwise, we reach an agreement with you, you get kicked out in 2024 by Donald Trump, and we're right back where we started. So it's been, to say the least, and I know some of the Americans involved, people like Rob Malley. It's been a tough negotiation. Zali.
What do you think is Iran's motivation in expanding its influence in Iraq and Syria?
The Islamic Republic that was established in 1979, and one of its first acts, obviously, was to take over the American embassy and hold our diplomats hostage for 444 days. That regime is more of a movement than a conventional government, all right? Among other things, they believe they have the right to speak for and protect Shia Muslims, no matter where they exist on earth. I mean, I remember listening to these Track 2 meetings. This was explained by one of the Iranian team members, a fine fellow who had done his university education in Iowa. Okay, and he said, Fred, you know, this is a sense of mission. Sense of mission. We have to be in places like Lebanon and now Iraq to protect Shia. I said, how about all the Shia living in the United States? And he kind of changed the subject.
Shia crescent. There's ones that connect Iran and all the Shia.
Yeah, that's an expression that popped up in the Arab world, mostly in the Sunni Arab world. The existence of a Shia crescent that connects Iran all the way through Iraq, through Syria, and all the way to the Mediterranean in Lebanon. Yeah, the whole Mesopotamia and the Levant. Yeah. Yes.
Could you give us a quick estimate of what the result of the American war on Iraq has been?
Yeah, I give you one word estimate: catastrophic. Yeah, we're going to be living with the results of that for a long time. I was not in government when the decision was made to invade Iraq in 2003. My former business partner was in government. His name was Richard Armitage. He was the Deputy Secretary of State to Colin Powell, so I would speak with him periodically about what was going on. And he said, the biggest concern that Secretary Powell and I have is that the people planning this invasion, both, started with, the Vice President of the United States all the way down to General Franks at Central Command, think this is going to be easy, okay? And he said, for a lot of people, this is the most attractive aspect of it. The belief that we can be in and out of Iraq in 6 to 9 months, that we could establish a democracy. One thing I do push back on, though, you hear it quite often, is that the Bush administration lied about the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I honestly don't think that's the case. They truly believed it. They did believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and they were truly shocked when it turned out it was not the case. I had an accidental early indicator of this when I went in one time to have a talk with Deputy Secretary Armitage. At the time, there was a UN inspector. I can't remember, Scandinavian maybe. His name was Hans Blix. Okay. Hans Blix was racing. Looked like, from the old Bob Hope show, Jerry Colonna, racing around Iraq, looking for weapons of mass destruction. And when I had this conversation with Secretary Armitage, I said, look, why don't we make life easier for this poor bastard? Why don't we tell him where to look? And he said, we don't know. Okay. But I am absolutely convinced, based on his testimony, Secretary Powell, there was a sincere belief that chemical weapons, biological weapons, the beginning of a nuclear it was all there. It just needed to be found. And when people would say, we can wait, and I think it was Condi Rice said, it'd be terrible if the first indicator were a mushroom cloud. People believed it, but the real, the thing that in my view was really negligent was the idea that this was going to be an easy operation. I was informally part of a State Department group as a civilian trying to come up with plans to guide an occupation of Iraq. The previous CENTCOM commander before Tommy Franks, Tony Zinni, one of the finest one of the finest Marine Corps officers who ever lived, had a plan for governing Iraq under military occupation that was bigger than the Encyclopedia Britannica. It was like 15 volumes, okay? His successor, General Franks, came in and one of the first things he ordered, shred all of that. If we're going to go to war in Iraq, my mission will be to take Baghdad, period. That's it. And that's what happened. 18 days of military operations up the Euphrates River. Baghdad taken. General Franks goes on leave. My job here is done. And the rest of the U.S. government suddenly discovering that people like Ahmed Shalabi, who had promised they would take over, were worthless, absolutely worthless. The rest of the government is scrambling to put together something. And we send the army home the Iraqi army just dismiss it? I mean, it's almost like we deliberately set the stage for an insurrection. That's clearly not what we did in terms of deliberation. But as I try to convince my students at Bard, incompetence, inattention, negligence plays a much bigger role than you might think sometimes in government. Yes?
On a more personal note, apart from intestinal fortitude, what is required, what do you, after all of your years of experience, think are the requirements for a successful diplomat and successful diplomacy in these kinds of situations? What personal characteristics do the men and women who are on the front lines, what do you think is best?
You know, there are characteristics. Tom Fletcher, who was the British ambassador in Lebanon a few years ago, wrote a brilliant book called The Naked Diplomat, and he talks about some of the characteristics that he thinks are essential for successful diplomacy. You obviously have to know the brief. You gotta do your homework thoroughly. You have got to be able to listen carefully. I mean, I've seen in my own experience in the State Department some senior and fairly famous diplomats who were constantly on broadcast, and they had to rely on aides to listen and capture the reply of the counterpart. Honesty and integrity are very, very, very important. The quickest way to lose your credibility as a diplomat is to be caught lying, all right? And a lot of people kind of relying on the Hollywood characterizations of what diplomats do think that diplomats are just trained liars. Sometimes, as an agent of your government, you have to present a difficult case. Okay, but lying about it is absolutely the worst thing you can do. The ability to write, reporting is very, 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 very important. And nowadays, with 24/7 news coverage around the world, diplomats do a lot less in the way of reporting and a lot more in the way of explaining. Okay, because the news is already out there. When I was in Lebanon, when the Iraqi embassy was blown up a mile and a half from our embassy, and I raced around in my K car and to see what happened. I think, if I recall correctly, Washington was hearing about this for the first time from me when I got back to the embassy and wrote a report. That's not the case anymore. The news is already out there. What diplomats have to do is explain as best they can what has happened. Why has it happened? What does this mean for the United States? What should we be doing about it? And the other thing Tom Fletcher mentions is that one of the absolute keys to successful diplomacy is the ability to eat and drink anything for the sake of your country. Okay? All right, well, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure.